Hello everybody, this is Steven Srajian here with another episode of Passive Wrappings. Now, I'm a human, and like a lot of humans, I create things, and I'm here with another creative individual today, Larry Asaro. Now, Larry, what is your background in?
Well, thank you, Steve, for having me here today. My background as a professional architect. I spent several years studying architecture and practicing architecture in Boston, Miami, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. So as a basis for a career in visual arts, I had been a designer for quite a while and being trained in form, pattern, texture, color, light, being able to use all of those to create buildings and spaces for people. It transferred very easily for me into sort of a missing aspect of design as I was growing up. Always missing. As a child, I loved to draw and loved to doodle. But as an adult, I started to use the camera. And right after college, I got my first camera and explored photography, black and white, color, and all aspects of it, and learned to use the 35 millimeter camera to control exposure, speed of the shot, and the f-stops and the shutter speeds. And today, now that I'm retired after that career in architecture, I've taken up digital photography and applying some of the same principles to that. I've had experience with the Photoshop, which I don't use, although I have experience with it. I tend to rely mostly on simple controls to adjust exposure, light, color, and try for more of a artistic approach in the photography. I don't know if you want to know, I'm from Braintree originally, so it's very local, and right now I'm living in Weymouth. And as I mentioned earlier, my career started in architecture in Miami and traveled to the West Coast and then came back to Boston. And through my travels, I've taken lots of travel photography. It's not really my main interest, though. My main interest really is, I think as you probably noticed with the Buoys project, we'll
get to a bit later.
Yeah.
I will bring up on the screen some of the early work that you talked about. You talked about the 35 millimeter?
Sure, I did, yeah.
And we have a couple of those here that you brought with you.
Oh, good, good.
So this is one of them. Now, what year was this that you were working on these?
Oh, this would have to be 1974, I think. I graduated in 1973 at the University of Miami, and immediately started taking pictures after that. This picture was a trip to a zoo, and I believe it was Crandon Park in Florida. In fact, memory serves me correctly. And the elephants were there. And I think it's a good example of pattern and texture. I think when you look at this, you'll see that the crust on the ear, the mud on the ear. In fact, I think the title is called Mud Flap. It's a black and white study, and I learned to use black and white in Miami. I think one of the nice things about Miami was the light there. You have very bright light, and so you have a lot of contrast, and there are a lot of white buildings and a lot of dark shadows. So most of the subjects are in bright light, and there's a high level of contrast to them. So they give you a good medium for expressing that contrast.
Yeah, there's a lot of different tone and shading going on in the texture of this photograph.
Yes. Yeah.
And this other one that you brought, was this also down there?
This is also in Miami. This is at Dinner Key, which was a sort of recreational boat launch area. And this is Ike. His last name, he's dead now, deceased, Ike Perry, who worked for the city of Coconut Grove. And this is where this was taken. And again, he's sitting in the shade. One thing nice I like about this photograph is I learned to use the different films, the black and white films, by their speeds. The Panatomic, I don't remember what they're all called now, but they had 25, they had 125, and they had 400 speed films. And when you use the 400 speed film, you got less contrast.
Right.
So when you started shooting in shade, and you wanted to have a little less contrast, you use this film. So this was, and I have a lot of portrait studies using this film. This is part of a series of probably 20 photographs of portraits that I have. Some here, and some also taken in San Francisco. Now the lighting in San Francisco is totally different because it's flat. If you go to San Francisco in the fog, and it's always foggy in San Francisco, you'll notice the lighting is very flat. You don't have bright sunlight a lot. You'll have diffuse sunlight. So the combination of the diffuse sunlight and the black and white film is amazing. And I don't think I have any examples from San Francisco, but if you go to my website, you can see that.
So you had a long career as an architect.
45 years.
So if you can go back and just remember, what is it that initially drew you into architecture?
Oh, sure. I think that's pretty easy. I love to draw.
Mm-hmm.
And as a child, every piece of paper in the house was covered with scribblings by me. And I used to imagine spaceships that people could live in, cars that people could live in that could fly. Those were spaceships. And I would start drawing floor plans in those vehicles. Mm-hmm. I grew up with a good understanding of geometry and a love for very industrial things. I grew up in South Braintree Square, and it was in a very industrialized area 60 years ago. Well, actually 100 years ago, it was all in industry. But when I grew up there, there was a coal yard, a lumber yard, and a factory, Armstrong Cork. They made Armstrong flooring there. It used water power, and it was a playground for me. So I grew up in all these old buildings, and I just loved old, worn-out things to play around. And I loved the spaces, and I would just go out there by myself and play and draw. And I loved that. I was drawn to architecture. So when the time came, I went in high school and did mechanical drawing, which was a course that was available, and learned to really draw mechanically and rigorously. And then went into architecture school from high school. So,
yeah, I found when I was doing my undergraduate work and I had to learn how to draw in the three-dimensional perspective, I actually liked the approach that architects took over the approach that fine artists took. I found that actually a lot easier to approach it that way.
yes.
So we actually have some examples here of your early experiments in three-dimensional work. So this first one here that we're going to put up, would you mind explaining just like what is the medium is a pencil here?
This is pencil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, I think it might have been felt tip pen and colored pencil, I think. And this actually is a later version. When I came back to Boston, this was a study for a boathouse at Boston University. If you can see that there's the Boston University Bridge in the background there. It's hard to recognize, but you can see it's the Charles River to the right with some sailboats there. And the building in the foreground is a proposed sailing facility for them, a new sailing club for Boston University. And we didn't win the project. Actually, somebody else won it, and they actually built it on the other side of the river. On the other side of the river. But this is an example of the type of artwork that architects do when they are envisioning projects and trying to sell those projects to clients.
So let's talk about that process.
Sure.
So a piece like this, who would this be presented to generally? What would you would show this early off in the process when you were trying to get the project? When you're trying to get the contract?
Yes, that is one way. You would be doing a study. So there's several ways to get projects in architecture, and one of them is to compete with other architects. And the client, in this case, let's say Boston University, would ask for competitors to present a solution. Now, it's always a risk to present a solution because you never know how far you should go and how much money you should spend on those solutions.
Right.
So the looser sketches and the quick sketches become more cost-effective rather than, and today, honestly, they actually do spend tons of money on these competitions, and they use computer-generated renderings now and very professional-looking work. So in this case, this was not a competition. We had already worked with Boston University to develop a a recreational facility, and actually the recreational facility was for Boston BU High.
Okay.
On the left-hand side of the building, on the other side of the rendering on the other side of the bridge, is the proposed facility for the Boston High School BU High. I hope I'm saying the right university. It might have been Boston College. No, it was BU High Recreation Facility. So we already had a client, and he had asked us to explore some options for a sailing club, a new sailing club. So this was one of the options, and as a quick study, these things, you draw the plans up, you put together the program, and then you render it, basically, or do a quick sketch. And we could turn these out very quickly. So this probably takes only 6 hours to generate a sketch like this.
Okay. So that's a lot more time effective than having to put in for these very extensive plans and having to present that early off in the process when you don't even know if you have the project.
It is. The only drawback is every time you want to change, you have to redo it completely. And today with computers, if you make a change, you can just adjust a few things, and it'll change the whole geometry by itself. So.
Now, this seems how would you explain this one here? I have an idea of what I'm looking at, but actually probably better if you explained it.
Well, you're starting to get into one of the aspects of architecture that I really, really relish. And it's sort of the ability to see how things go together and to illustrate that. And part of my drawing as a youth and as I grew into loving to draw, I discovered some very wonderful drawings of automobiles that showed the insides. I think they were basically airbrushed, but you would see the outside of the car, and then it was almost like it was made out of plastic, and you could see the engine and everything inside, and then you could even see inside the engine. So I sort of adapted that to my architecture career, and when I had to explain to people, contractors or other people in the office, how this was going to be built, I would draw sketches like this that would show the structure. This is a stairway, by the way. So
right.
You see the handrail coming down, the stair treads coming down, and then little sections being cut through the steel deck and the steel channel underneath supporting it all, and the stair stringers along the side, and so how they were all assembled. So this is what it was going to look like. So this shows how it's built, how it's constructed, and it's all done in a single sketch.
So this shows the cross section that would actually be useful for communicating with contractors.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Now this one seems a lot more basic than those last ones.
Oh, this was just a fun sketch. Yeah. This was just for fun. I had was trying to remember. I learned early in mechanical drawing again how to draw an ellipse, and they didn't deal with ellipses in perspective, just ellipses in orthogonal projection. So I said, I wonder if it applies to perspective. So I decided I would draw ellipses on a cube, the faces of a cube, and just leave them as holes and put a sphere inside. So it was just a cute little exercise that I did for myself. It's just pen and ink to draw those ellipses and give myself some guidelines in at different angles and with different foreshortened planes.
So I think this brings up an interesting question, which is if somebody's interested in pursuing architecture, are these the sort of experiments that they should be doing to understand space?
Well, yes, they could. Geometry is an essential ingredient to architecture. You have to really understand geometry and be facile with all forms and of different shapes. You have to understand, and it's also translates into photography, because light defines shape and form. So when you're learning about a cube or a sphere or a cone or a cylinder and all those different forms and shapes and geometry, you learn how the light emphasizes the volume and the form of the shape itself. So yes, geometry is important for architecture students. Mathematics is important. Science is very important now. Absolute building has now become a very elaborate science. When we build now, well, I don't build anymore. The building is constructed to conserve energy and conserve all forms, including the lighting is important, and you have to understand how the lighting impacts the energy. You have to understand how the building wall transfers heat from the outside of the building to the inside of the building, and glass and wall and different materials. So the engineering aspect of architecture has really come into play. The aesthetics of architecture, some people will just start with the aesthetics. You've heard stories probably about architects who will crumble up tissue paper,
Yes.
throw it across the floor, and go, that looks like a museum. Let's build a museum. And that happens, but behind it all, there's a lot of science.
Yeah, I've noticed that sort of approach jumps over a number of steps that I'm sure they have to go back and backwards construct when you decide to design like that.
It does. I worked for an architect in Miami who he'd come into the office and say, I've got a new commission, a new building. I'm going to do a house for this woman. And she lives in South Miami, and it's going to be a square, with this kind of roof on it. Go ahead, work on that. So right away you'd be given, the initial parameter instead of approaching it organically with, okay, how do the rooms fit together and function best, and how does it flow? Now you have to work within a dictated form already. So it's an interesting approach as well.
Now I've noticed a lot of that kind of materiality, that focus on materials carries over into the photography work that you're doing these days.
Absolutely.
And I have some of them here, actually, the work that I was first introduced to you with. Because you had a show a few months back.
Yes.
And we both have a connection.
We do.
With a certain person who actually works at this depot. So why don't you explain to me what it is that we're looking at here?
Well, I could simply say they're buoys. I'm sure there's a name for them. In fact, I think they're cans. But there's a long story about obtaining these photographs. And
yes, there is.
I think, I'll shorten it. I'll shorten it. I drove by that depot.
Yes.
And out of the corner of my eye, and the corner of my eye is another whole theory about photography and my approach, which I sort of call peripherality. And I believe that things on the periphery have more impact than things in the center of things. And we're more impacted and affected by them. And a lot of times in my photography, I leave things, instead of the rule of thirds, which everybody likes to play around with, I like to leave things down in a corner or off on the edge that give you that little, ooh, look at that on the side. But anyway, driving by, and in the corner of my eye, I just these red and green things. And I slowed down and turned. Behind a fence were these gigantic buoys, lying on their sides all over the place. And I was like, oh, what is that? I pulled off. I had my camera with me. I went up to the chain link fence. I took some pictures. Oh, these are great. These are beautiful. And I wanted to get in, but there was no way to get in, and there was no phone number, no address. Like, oh, this is top secret stuff here. I better be careful. So I did find a number. I called. And after 3-4 phone calls, I finally got somebody in Washington, D.C., who was in charge of the Coast Guard art program. And she got me permission, to go into the facility. And once I got into the facility, I had free rein, although I was warned to stay away from the buoys because they weigh several tons and they'll crush you if they fall. So I did stay away from them, and I took 500 photos of these buoys, and they were rusted and crusted and busted, and some of them were like lying in a pile ready to be scrapped, and others were going to be refurbished. And I just was totally fascinated by these. I mentioned earlier my fascination with industrial things and growing up in an industrial area.
This one has a very industrial feel to it.
Yes, yeah. Some of them some are abstracted more than others. In some cases, you would never even know that some of those photos are buoys. But in others, you'd look at that and go, I think that looks like a buoy. So here this one is a really good example of playing with the exposure to get the colors. I see colors that don't exist sometimes. When I look at things in architecture as subjects, I look at them and I'll say, oh, there's like a blue-green in that shadow. How do I get that out? So sometimes you see those things. If you look quickly, you just see black and white. But if you start to take time, you see a lot of other things in there. So this trick is manipulating you've got several controls. You've got your brightness, and you've got shadows and highlights, and a number of controls to play with. And people who have Photoshop have an infinite number of controls and they can set the ranges on the controls. It's amazing. But this is simply just a little adjustment to allow the shadows to brighten up a little bit. And once I did that, the colors in the shadows I said, whoa, look at those. So you get the purples and the magentas and everything that are in the shadows. And to me, it makes a photograph more like a painting. And that's really my approach, is to really try and end up with something that looks like it was painted, not photographed.
And this one here also, I'm wondering if you didn't know what these movies looked like, if you would be able to guess what this is.
Oh, no.
I know because I know what they look like.
Sure.
But if you had never seen one with a photo like this, I'm not sure if you would make that guess.
Probably not. Probably not. And the numbers on them, I mean, this one I had to specifically get because I wanted that 15 to show. And I found out a very interesting thing, that green buoys are odd numbered and red buoys are even numbered. So it's a learning experience at the same time.
Now this next one is not a buoy, but it's more of this industrial theme that you're working on.
This one is titled Pipe Dream, and if you look at it long enough, you'll start dreaming. And this is a black and white version. The color version, I think, is actually better, and the color version was in a show just about a year ago. But I've got the black and white version here because I really like the contrast and the colors. And I learned a long time ago that with black and white, you want to make sure you have detail in the shadows, and you don't lose detail in the highlights. And I forget, with film, there was a rule, expose for the shadows and develop for the highlights, or something. Maybe I have it backwards. I don't remember. But that's what you want in a good photograph, a good black and white photograph, is you want to be able to see the detail in the shadow areas, and you don't want the highlight areas, the whites, to be washed out. You still want detail there. So when I did this, I said, this one is just coming out great. I just need to print this one. It is it looks like a refinery. It's actually from an old Procter & Gamble plant in Hingham. Actually, it's in Quincy. It's just over the Four River Bridge.
Okay.
Route 3A, if people know where that is. There are a lot of tanks over there as you go over the bridge heading north into Boston. On the right-hand side, there are a lot of tanks over there. And there was a Procter & Gamble facility. They used to make soap products and things like that. And I guess this was part of it. And I was on the boat, the ferry, one day. So this is how I saw this. And the ferry actually gets close as it pulls out of the terminal that was there in Hingham. And I just had my camera with me, and I saw it, and I said, wow, I got to take some pictures of this. So this is one of 3 or 4 that I really like of that facility. But it gives you an idea of sort of the complexities of line and pattern and texture that can be created with just a graphic approach to photography.
Now this one is a lot more simple, a lot more straightforward.
It is.
Than the other ones.
This is actually, this was taken at Strawberry Bank up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and there's some old historical buildings there, and I just happened to line myself up. As I was walking by, I was looking in the windows, and I said, oh, I can see through. And then I said, oh, and I can see through again, and I can see through again. And then I said, oh, and I can also get reflections of what's behind me. So I'm sort of fascinated with the reflection quality of light and glass surfaces. Being an architect, you use a lot of glass, and you work with it because there's many colors of glass and many reflectivities of it, and it does a lot. There's transparency to it. It lets you view through it, and it lets you also, there's reflections in it. So I've been working a lot. I have a lot of photographs like this with both the reflection and the vision through the glass. And yeah, it's a graphic composition. You know, I think composition is number one in any photography and art.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a good composition, a strong composition.
Composition is foundational.
Absolutely, absolutely foundational. So when you get a composition that you really like and the elements are working for you, there's nothing like perspective. You know, everybody likes perspective, and everybody likes things that winding road that kind of disappears off in the distance. Mm-hmm. But this is sort of like that disappearing in the distance. It's a layering of the same element being repeated. You notice the mullions in the window. The first one, the second one you look through, the third one, and you can't really see through the next one, but it's there.
Yeah, we're getting this feeling of the outside and the inside and the outside again.
Absolutely.
We're seeing the reflection off the glass as well at the same time. So we're getting a lot of layers going on in this photo.
It's mystical. It's there, yeah. You are getting a lot of layers there. Yep.
So before we go, you have a lot of other photos. So the first thing I want to do is tell people, where can they see more of your work?
They can visit my website, www.aleft-handedview, all one word, .com.
You want to give a short explanation as to why you call it that?
Well, I'm left-handed, of course. It's a different way of seeing things, and I think that as a child growing up in a right-handed world and adapting to the designs of certain tools and sporting equipment, I think it does something to the way you perceive the world, and I think it has affected my vision. Mm-hmm. And my approach to people have always told me, you see things differently. And I ascribe that to that sort of left-handedness that I have. So I think that's why I sort of call that a left-handed view.
I want to thank you so much for coming here today, Larry, giving us a chance to look at your work, tell us about how it is that you got into photography and architecture. And this is Steven Sarajian signing out for Passive Wrappings, and be on the lookout for our next episode. And if you're watching this television, go ahead and subscribe to me on YouTube as well, so you can check back on these episodes. All right, so that's Steven Sarajian signing out.